I was mid-sentence, telling the cashier I didn't need a bag, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead the way they always do in that particular grocery store, when a laugh from 3 registers overstopped every single word in my throat at once. Not a similar laugh. Not a laugh that reminded me of something. The exact laugh, that specific 2-beat huff followed by a low chuckle. The one I hadn't heard in 20 years, since I was 12 years old, since the night my older brother Michael disappeared without a word and never came back. I didn't even see his face yet. My whole body just went cold and certain at the same time. The way you know a sound before you consciously place it, and every hair on my arm stood up before my brain had caught up to my own instincts. The cashier was still talking to me, I realized distantly, asking if I wanted my receipt in the bag or in hand, and I must have answered her somehow because she moved on to the next customer, but I have no memory of what I said. I turned my head slowly, half convinced I was about to embarrass myself in front of a total stranger over nothing, and there he was. Older, obviously, gray threading through dark hair that used to be exactly like mine, a little heavier through the shoulders than the lanky 17-year-old I remembered, a small white scar above his left eyebrow I didn't recognize at all. But the laugh, the way he tilted his head slightly when he handed over his card to the cashier, the specific crooked set of his mouth on the right side when he smiled at something she'd said, a smile I would have picked out of 1,000 strangers without hesitation. 20 years fell away in about 4 seconds, and I stood there frozen in the middle of a grocery store aisle, my cart abandoned halfway between the cereal and the checkout line, absolutely certain, with zero real evidence beyond a feeling too strong to argue with, that I was looking at my brother. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust my own voice not to shake, not to crack in some embarrassing way in the middle of a public checkout line. I just left my cart where it stood, walked out behind him at a distance that probably looked suspicious to anyone paying attention, and managed to get his license plate memorized, a rental-looking sedan, dark blue, plate ending in 4KT, before he pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared down the main road. I sat in my own car for almost 10 minutes afterward, hands still gripping the wheel at 10, and 2 like I was about to drive somewhere, feeling like I'd either just seen a ghost or lost my mind completely, with no real way yet to tell which one was true. I need to go back, because to understand how impossible that moment felt, standing in a grocery store on an entirely ordinary Tuesday, you need to understand how the story had ended for our family 20 years earlier. Michael was 17 when he disappeared. I was 12, small for my age, the kind of younger brother who worshipped the ground his older brother walked on in that uncomplicated, total way only younger siblings really manage. There'd been a fight with our father the night before, loud, ugly, the kind that carried clearly through the thin wall between our bedrooms, about something I was too young at the time to fully understand, something about money Michael supposedly owed someone, about him staying out too late on school nights, about choices our father didn't approve of and never explained clearly enough for a 12-year-old to follow. I remember lying awake in the dark listening to raised voices, my father's low and furious, Michael's higher and defensive, until eventually the house went quiet and I fell asleep assuming, the way kids do, that everything would look smaller and more manageable in the morning. It didn't. In the morning, Michael's bed was empty, the sheets still rumpled like he'd only just gotten up, his duffel bag gone from the closet floor where it always sat, and that was it. No note, no call, nothing. My mother found his empty room before any of the rest of us were even fully awake, and I remember the specific sound she made from the hallway, a sound I'd never heard a grown adult make before and hoped never to hear again. The police treated it almost from day one as a runaway case, a 17-year-old with a documented, witnessed fight the night before, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle anywhere in the house. My father, in his anger and his own particular brand of stubborn wounded pride, told the responding officers Michael had probably just gone off somewhere to prove a point, and somehow that framing stuck to the entire investigation from that very first day like it had been poured in concrete. Within a few months the file was quietly marked as voluntary departure, and within a couple of years nobody official was looking anymore at all. My mother never stopped looking, not really. Not in any way that showed up on official paperwork. She kept his room exactly the way he'd left it. The same faded band posters curling slightly at the corners, the same navy bedspread, dusted every single week for 20 years like he might walk back through the door on some ordinary afternoon and need it all waiting for him. Unchanged, proof that we hadn't given up even if the world around us clearly had. I grew up believing, the way you believe things you're too young to properly question or interrogate, that my brother had simply chosen to leave the rest of us behind. It took me years, well into my 20s, to even admit to myself how relieved I'd eventually felt once I finally stopped actively looking for him in every crowd, every gas station, every stranger on the street who happened to walk with a similar gait. I'm ashamed of that relief now, genuinely ashamed, looking back. I didn't understand yet, standing frozen in that produce aisle 2 decades later, how completely wrong I'd been to ever feel it. I went back to that same grocery store 3 more times over the following week, at different hours, feeling increasingly unhinged sitting in a parked car watching the automatic doors like I was running a stakeout in a bad late-night movie. On the 4th visit, I finally saw him again, coming down the cereal aisle with a small handheld basket, and this time I didn't let myself hesitate the way I had before. I walked straight up to him, heart slamming against my ribs so hard I could feel it pulsing in my throat, and said his name out loud for the first time in 20 years. Michael. He turned toward the sound of his own name, and for exactly 1 second, one single unguarded, unrehearsed second before something shut down behind his eyes like a door swinging closed, I watched pure, total recognition cross his face. Then it was gone, replaced almost instantly by something practiced and flat, a mask slipping neatly into place. "I'm sorry, you got the wrong person," he said, already stepping back, already angling his whole body away from me toward the end of the aisle. "My name's David." And he walked away fast, faster than a man simply heading toward checkout with a half-full basket, weaving between other shoppers' carts like he needed distance from me more urgently than he needed groceries. I followed him again. I'm not especially proud of that, but I couldn't make myself stop. Not after 20 years, not after finally hearing that exact laugh again. I followed his car for 25 minutes down increasingly unfamiliar roads to a modest single-story house in a quiet town I'd never had any real reason to visit before. Wrote the address down on the back of a gas station receipt with a hand that wouldn't quite stop shaking, and sat outside in my car for another hour afterward just staring at the front door, trying to talk myself out of the growing certainty that I hadn't lost my mind after all. I told my mother that night, sitting across from her at her kitchen table, the same worn table Michael used to do his algebra homework at, complaining loudly about it the entire time. She didn't believe me, not fully, not at first, or rather, I think she wanted to believe me so badly, so instantly and completely, that it terrified her to let herself. "Peter, we've been through this before," she said quietly, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour earlier without either of us noticing. "Every few years somebody thinks they see him somewhere, a mall in another state, a photo online, a stranger at a wedding once. Remember that. I can't do this again, sweetheart. I can't let myself hope like that and then have it turn out to be nothing, not one more time." I understood her fear completely, because I'd felt that exact certainty collapse into disappointment myself more than once as a kid, chasing strangers down sidewalks who always, eventually, turn out to just be strangers wearing an unfamiliar face I'd projected something onto. But this felt different, fundamentally different, and I told her so as clearly as I could, and she finally made me promise not to say another word about it to anyone until I actually had something real to bring her. I went back to the house alone 3 days later, parking a block away this time, some instinct telling me not to pull directly into the driveway. David answered the door on the second knock, and whatever composure he'd managed to hold together in the grocery store was gone entirely now. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with actual age, dark circles under his eyes, and there was real fear written across his face, not simple annoyance at a persistent stranger. "You need to leave," he said, voice low and urgent, glancing past my shoulder toward the street like he was checking exactly who might be watching us from a parked car or a passing window. "You need to leave right now and never come back here. You have absolutely no idea what you're doing or what you're risking." "I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth," I said, and my voice cracked in a way that embarrassed me even in that moment. "I know who you are. I've known since the first second I heard you laugh in that checkout line." He started to shut the door on me, and that's when I saw it, a small, pale, crescent-shaped scar on his forearm just below the elbow, half hidden by his rolled-up sleeve. I knew that scar instantly, the way you know something in your body before your conscious mind fully catches up. Michael got it falling out of the treehouse our father built in the backyard the summer he was 9, split his arm open badly on a nail sticking out sideways from the ladder, needed 6 stitches at the emergency room, and cried the entire car ride there while I sat buckled into the back seat. For years old, absolutely convinced my big brother was going to die right there in the front seat. I hadn't consciously thought about that scar in probably 15 years. Seeing it now, on a stranger's arm in a stranger's doorway, hit me harder than almost anything else that whole week. The treehouse, I said. Dad's ladder. The one with the loose nail he never fixed. You were 9. I was 4, and I cried harder than you did the entire way to the hospital, and you kept telling me to stop because I was making it worse. Something in him broke completely at that, right there in the doorway. His shoulders dropped visibly. His hand fell away from the edge of the door, and for a long, suspended moment he just stood there staring at me like he was looking directly at a memory instead of an actual living person standing on his porch. Peter, he finally said, quiet, almost disbelieving, and it was the first time in 20 years I'd heard my own brother say my name out loud. And I felt something in my chest come apart completely at the sound of it, some tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for 2 decades. He let me in, finally, checking the street carefully twice before he closed the door firmly behind us, and for the next hour he told me the truth in halting, scattered pieces, stopping every few minutes to glance toward the front windows, his hands never quite fully still in his lap the entire time. He hadn't run away. At 17, he told me, sitting across from me in a small, sparsely furnished living room that felt more like a waiting room than an actual home, he'd witnessed something he was never supposed to see. A killing connected to a man named Vic Calloway, someone our own father had unknowingly gotten entangled with through a debt that Michael, not our father, had actually been the one quietly trying to work off by doing odd, cash-only jobs for exactly the wrong kind of people. Michael had been in the wrong place at precisely the wrong time one night, seen exactly what he shouldn't have seen from behind a stack of pallets in a warehouse loading dock, and within days found himself facing a decision no 17-year-old should ever, under any circumstances, have to face alone: testify against a genuinely dangerous, well-connected man, or stay silent forever and simply hope nobody ever traced anything back to him. He testified, and because of what that testimony put directly at risk, federal authorities placed him into emergency witness relocation almost overnight, barely giving him any real time to process what was actually happening to his own life, let alone say goodbye to anyone in it. They told me any contact with the family could put all of you in danger too, he said, staring down at his own hands like they belonged to someone else. Not just me. You, Mom, Dad. They said total severance was the only way anyone could guarantee your safety, that even a single phone call could theoretically be traced back, that even a letter through the mail was too much risk to take. I didn't choose to disappear like that, Peter. I was 17 years old, completely terrified, and I did exactly what I was told to do, because I genuinely believed it was the only thing keeping all of you safe from what I'd already dragged into your lives without meaning to. I sat with that for a long, heavy moment, feeling 20 years of assumed abandonment rearrange itself completely and painfully inside my chest, like furniture being dragged across a room I thought I already fully understood. Why did the case file never mention any of this? I asked eventually. Why did it just say, flatly, that you left voluntarily? Why did the police let Dad's version of it stand unquestioned? That was the cover story, he said, constructed deliberately on purpose by the people who relocated me. A runaway teenager draws far less official attention and far fewer awkward follow-up questions than an active witness sitting in federal protective custody. It was designed specifically to make everyone eventually stop looking, including all of you. He looked up at me then, eyes visibly wet. It worked exactly the way it was designed to work. I just never fully understood, until right now, sitting across from you in this room, how much that meant you all genuinely believed I'd simply chosen to walk out on this family. Mom never fully believed it, I said quietly. Not really, not underneath. She kept your room exactly the way you left it. 20 years, Michael. She's been dusting it every single week for 20 straight years. He put his face in both hands at that, and I watched my brother, a grown man I hadn't laid eyes on since he was 17 years old, cry the way I remembered him crying exactly once before in our entire childhood. The day of the treehouse, except this time there was no simple bandage or 6 stitches that was going to fix what was actually broken. He explained once he'd composed himself again a few minutes later, why he still couldn't safely reveal himself now. 20 years later, with whatever original danger from his testimony presumably long faded into the past. Vic Calloway, it turned out, was up for parole within the next several months, his first realistic chance at release since his original sentencing decades earlier, and the Marshal Service had specifically advised David, only a few weeks before I'd first spotted him in that grocery store, to maintain a specially strict protocol until the hearing's final outcome was determined one way or the other. "It's not permanent," he said, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "It's not supposed to be forever, not anymore. That's not how it works today for most people in the program. It's just the timing is unbelievably bad, Peter. Out of every possible week in 20 years, you found me at maybe the single worst moment to have found me. I spent the following 2 weeks trying to figure out what to actually do with what I now knew. Genuinely torn between my mother's absolute right to finally learn the truth and my brother's very real, very current, entirely justified fear. I eventually tracked down a retired U.S. Marshal named Owens, who had personally handled Michael's original relocation case decades earlier, according to an old newspaper clipping I found buried in a library archive, now long retired himself, and it turned out, willing to talk in careful general terms once I explained enough of the situation for him to understand exactly who I was and why I was asking. He couldn't confirm specific details of any active or former case, he told me carefully, sitting across from me at his own small kitchen table in a way that felt strangely, uncomfortably similar to the conversation I'd already had with my mother days earlier. But he could confirm in broad, honest strokes that emergency relocations for teenage witnesses back in that particular era had been badly under-resourced across the board, that total severance from family had genuinely been standard operating protocol at the time regardless of how young or how frightened the witness happened to be, and that the voluntary departure cover story I described to him matched almost exactly the kind of quiet arrangement his division routinely used to construct in cases like this one. It wasn't a good system back then, Owens told me, rubbing his jaw slowly. We did what we could with the resources and the rules we actually had, but a scared 17-year-old kid deserved a whole lot more real support than we were ever set up to give him at the time. I've thought about cases like that more than you'd probably guess. Over the years, more than most people would assume a retired marshal sits around thinking about. Armed with that quiet corroboration, I finally had to face the hardest part of the entire ordeal, deciding whether and exactly how to tell my mother the full truth, knowing full well that her reaction, if not handled with real care, could genuinely put David's current safety at risk if she showed up somewhere unannounced or mentioned something to the wrong person out of pure overwhelming joy. I sat her down at that same kitchen table, told her everything I'd learned, start to finish, and watched 2 full decades of grief and disbelief and stubborn, unkillable hope collide across her face all at once, in real time. She wanted to drive straight there that same night. No waiting, no planning. It took real, deliberate effort and a firm promise that I would personally arrange everything properly and safely, to get her to wait even a few more days before doing anything at all. David set strict, specific conditions for the eventual reunion. A particular evening, no phones brought inside the house, absolutely no one else told beforehand under any circumstances, a driving route to the house that deliberately avoided the main road entirely. My mother walked through his front door almost exactly 20 years, nearly to the very week, since she'd last laid eyes on her oldest son, and I stood off to the side and watched a version of grief I had genuinely never witnessed in another human being before. Relief and fury and heartbreak all arriving in the exact same instant, completely indistinguishable from one another on her face. She didn't say a single word for almost a full minute, just stood frozen in the doorway with one hand pressed hard over her own mouth. And then she crossed the small room in 3 quick steps and held on to him, like she was physically afraid letting go. even for a second, would make him disappear all over again. It wasn't a clean, easy, movie-perfect reunion, and I think it would be dishonest of me to pretend otherwise now, looking back on it. There was real, raw anger underneath all that relief. 20 years is an enormous amount of time to spend grieving someone who wasn't actually gone at all, and my mother didn't try to hide from him how much that specific fact cost her, how many birthdays and holidays, and ordinary, quiet Tuesday evenings she'd spent silently aching over an absence that had been, in some meaningful sense, at least partially avoidable with a different system, a different level of basic care extended to one. Frightened teenage witness. David didn't defend himself against any of that anger. Not once, not even a little. He just sat there and absorbed it, all of it, told her again and again, in different words each time, how genuinely sorry he was that his own desperate attempt to protect all of us had somehow ended up costing us so much anyway, in a completely different, quieter way. With Calloway's parole hearing still looming ahead on the calendar, David worked closely with the Marshal Service over the following several weeks to establish something entirely new for himself, not the old, open, unguarded contact our family had once simply taken for granted, and not the total, absolute severance of the last 20 years either, but a carefully negotiated, deliberately bounded middle ground between the two. Monitored visits on a set schedule, occasional calls routed through secure channels, a flexible plan that could tighten again immediately if the parole hearing happened to go badly, but nonetheless a real, deliberate, hard-won step away from total isolation for the first time since he was 17 years old and terrified in the back of an unmarked federal car. My mother finally took the old posters down off his childhood bedroom wall a few months later, not out of any sense of moving on or letting go, but because David himself gently asked her to, the very first time he saw the room again in person. "I don't need it kept exactly the same to know you never stopped waiting for me," he told her, standing in the doorway of a room that still smelled faintly of the same laundry detergent she'd always used. "I think what I actually need now is to know we're building something genuinely new together, instead of all of us just quietly preserving what we already lost a long time ago." She cried, packing up those faded posters in a way that felt entirely different from 20 years of quiet, hopeless, weekly dusting. This time it felt like actual grief finally being allowed to move somewhere, instead of staying frozen in exactly the same place for 2 full decades. I think about that grocery store constantly now, more than I probably should. The version of myself standing frozen in the cereal aisle, so certain and so afraid of being wrong at the exact same time. I spent 20 years quietly mourning a brother who I believed had simply left us behind. I got to spend the rest of my life with a brother who never really did.